Nuclear fission is our next topic. This is the man-made nuclear reaction. The rest in general can occur naturally. Nuclear fission is the bombarding of heavy isotopes with slow neutrons. Again, we want to add the neutrons to the nucleus, not smack the neutrons into the nucleus. So we're going to break the heavy nucleus into two smaller ones. We get lots of energy out of this. Again, fission is not a spontaneous process. It can be controlled or it can be uncontrolled. For controlled nuclear fission, I have power plants. For uncontrolled, I have nuclear weapons. If we look at this diagram, we have a neutron coming to a uranium-235 nucleus, and that neutron attaches itself to the nucleus. Then the nucleus will split spontaneously into two smaller nuclei, and I get out again a series of neutrons. In this case, I have two neutrons. I can have 1 to 3 neutrons produced. If we take a look at a nuclear reactor, which is using a controlled nuclear reaction, we have large amounts of energy generated with a very small amount of fuel. For nuclear power plants, the primary fuels are either uranium-235 or plutonium-239. Uranium-235 is a not very common isotope of uranium. The most common isotope of uranium is uranium-238. And these isotopes then are packed into fuel rods, and what we have on the diagram here are the way that they're packed. So we start out with a pellet of uranium, which is about the size of one of the markers that are used on our whiteboard. And the pellets then get stacked inside a fuel rod, and then the fuel rods are packaged with control rods. And the fuel rods and the control rods are what determine how much energy is produced at any given amount of time. So the fuel rod is the energy source. The control rods absorb the extra neutrons. And for each neutron, I can start another fission reaction. So if I control the number of neutrons, I can control the rate of fission. The other thing that helps me control the rate of the reaction is something called a moderator. And the fuel rods and the control rods are surrounded by a moderator. And the moderator slows the neutrons down because when they are produced from a fission reaction, they're moving pretty quickly. And we need to slow those neutrons down if they're to be any use to continue our fission process. In the United States, water is the primary moderator. Graphite is used by other countries as a moderator as well. These items for the reactor are located inside what's called a containment vessel. That's to protect the environment from the nuclear radiation. Another thing that's inside the containment vessel is something called the steam generator. And if we take a look at a diagram of a nuclear power plant, we can identify these various things. We have the fuel rods. In many cases, they're in fixed position within the reactor itself. And the control rods then can be raised or lowered so that they are in between the fuel rods, and that allows them to soak up more or less in terms of neutrons, so those neutrons may or may not be available to continue the fission reaction. This whole pink region here is the reactor. The material that surrounds the fuel rods and the control rods is the moderator. The moderator, being water, flows, and so it flows through this system moving this way. It's very hot, superheated, several hundred degrees above the boiling point of water, but because it's under high pressure, it's still liquid. And it travels through and warms up this next structure, which is called a steam generator. And the steam generator does exactly that. It generates steam. The water in there is warmed up by the superheated water passing through the red tubes. The liquid water in the steam generator becomes steam, flows through the pipes and into the turbine. The steam makes the turbine blades spin, much like air makes the windmill blades spin, which drives a magnet inside the generator. And this is where electricity is made. As the steam passes through the turbine generator region, it cools down and it becomes liquid at the bottom of the turbine containment and then flows back into the steam generator region where it is again turned to steam. So we have one closed loop where we have radioactive water from the moderator circulating through the pipes, warming up water in the steam generator. We have a second closed loop where water from the steam generator becomes steam, goes into and drives the turbine, condenses, and goes back to be liquid in the steam generator again. We have a third loop, and this is outside cooling water. It is either hooked up to a cooling tower where water flows down large surface areas so that the heat from the liquid can be released to the atmosphere, or the cooling water loop can be hooked up to a lake or a river. This water is not radioactive, and it cools the water from the turbine loop, the steam generator loop, so it can go from steam back to liquid. So the third loop water is in contact with the environment and it's not radioactive. The water in the second loop is slightly radioactive. This is actually the water loop that released steam when 3 Mile Island had their release of steam. So it was from a very slightly radioactive loop of water, but it was not the moderator water. And this water is very radioactive. It's in contact with the fuel cells inside the reactor, and so it gets very radioactive. This thick structured dome here, sometimes it's a dome, sometimes not, is the containment vessel. It houses both the reactor and the steam generator. It is made of very thick reinforced steel and concrete to make sure that the environment is protected from the radioactive material within it. So we've gone through the 3 loops of water. The moderator water inside the reactor is loop 1. The water in the steam generator loop, slightly radioactive, it's loop 2, and then loop 3 is the cooling water, not radioactive, and they are all separate from each other. In the United States, we have about 103 reactors operational. There are a number more than that are not operational. That's what's working right now. About 22% of our electrical power comes from nuclear power plants. It is actually higher in other countries. The U.S. is one of the countries that uses a very small amount of nuclear power to generate electricity. Europe, it's significantly higher. Uranium-235 is the most popular isotope. It naturally occurs as uranium-238, but only about 0.7% of naturally occurring uranium is uranium-235. So what they have to do is enrich it, and they enrich it to a 5% uranium-235, and they also form uranium oxide rather than pure uranium metal. The metal, uranium, properties are not as good at high temperatures as uranium oxide, so the oxide is more stable. Here we're talking about chemical properties as opposed to nuclear reaction properties. A uranium pellet, 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch, so a 1/2 inch diameter by 1/2 inch tall, will provide energy equivalent to 1,800 pounds of coal or 150 gallons of fuel oil. So a very, very small amount of matter produces a very, very large amount of energy.